There are places in every game where something almost made it through, where a design lingered just long enough to leave traces behind. Generation 3 of Pokémon carries these quiet shadows, creatures sketched and coded, but never quite brought into the light. Some were replaced by familiar faces, while others simply faded from the files, their names still whispered in beta versions, discovered years later. These are the lost Pokémon of Hoenn, the designs that wandered close to existence before turning back into the drafting room. And before we drift any further, make sure to subscribe so once we reach 1,000 subs, I can reduce the ads, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. There was a Pokémon called Pokémon, though some internal files listed it as Pelicargo, and its shape was unmistakably similar to the Pelipper we eventually came to know. The difference rested in small details, the kind that shift a design from concept to completion. A small blip sat on the back of its head, a detail that might have resembled the handle of a ship's wheel, though more likely it connected to another idea entirely. Its large beak was shaped almost like a cartoon burglar's sack, the kind tied at the top with string, and that small protrusion on its head might have represented that very knot. The design leaned into the idea of a pelican as a carrier, a bird that steals or stores, and the exaggerated beak played with that visual metaphor in a way that felt playful but unfinished. Pelipper, in its final form, would refine this concept into something sleeker, losing the cartoonish burglar bag aesthetic in favor of a more natural pelican silhouette. But Paracon's rough edges hinted at the early drafts where designers were still deciding how literally to interpret the pelican's pouch. The hair-like feathers on Paracon also carried a faint resemblance to Swellow's plumage, which raises a quiet question about whether these two bird designs were once more closely related in the planning stages. Swellow itself is notably absent from many of the early beta files, which suggests that perhaps parts of its concept were split or redistributed among other avian Pokémon during development. What remains interesting is how Paracon shows the bridge between a rough idea and a polished creature. Game Freak's design process often involved taking broad concepts, testing them visually, and then refining them through iteration. Paracon represents one of those middle steps, a design that worked on paper but needed adjustment before it could stand alongside the rest of Hoenn's roster. The shift from burglar bag to simple pelican pouch might seem minor, but in Pokémon design, small changes often determine whether a creature feels cohesive or disjointed within its world. Another early design that carried echoes of something familiar was Yamanushi, a creature that eventually became Nuzleaf and Shiftry. In its beta form, Yamanushi looked almost exactly like a Tengu, the long-nosed yokai from Japanese folklore. It wore Geta sandals, the traditional wooden footwear associated with both Tengu and samurai, and carried Buddhist prayer beads, another motif tied to spiritual warriors and mountain-dwelling mystics. The nose was prominent, the design was direct, and the feedback from Game Freak's internal surveys reflected exactly that concern. The notes simply stated that it was too literal, too much of a direct representation of a Tengu without enough creative transformation. This feedback led to a significant redesign, one that shifted Yamanushi's appearance towards something more abstracted and playful. Nuzleaf, in its final form, retained the nose and the vaguely Tengu-inspired silhouette, but softened the details into something that felt more like a mischievous forest sprite than a literal folklore figure. Shiftry took that concept even further, blending the Tengu influence with fan imagery and a more menacing presence. The evolution from Yamanushi to Nuzleaf illustrates a core principle in Pokémon design, that inspiration should be recognizable, but never so direct that it feels like a costume rather than a creature. The prayer beads, the Geta sandals, and the rigid posture of Yamanushi all spoke to a design that was too anchored in its reference material. Pokémon designs work best when they take familiar elements and twist them into something new, something that feels like it belongs in a world of living creatures rather than a mythology textbook. Yamanushi was a step too close to that textbook, and the revision into Nuzleaf allowed the design to breathe, to feel less like a reference and more like a character. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it's worth noting how many of these early designs carried that same tension between homage and originality. Game Freak's designers often started with very literal interpretations of cultural symbols or animals, only to pull back and reinterpret those ideas with a lighter touch. Yamanushi's transformation into Nuzleaf is one of the clearest examples of this process, a design that began with reverence and ended with creativity. Kumaru was another early Pokémon that spoke to a specific cultural image, though its concept was rooted in something simpler than folklore. It was an acorn, small and round, with a green plant stem emerging from its mouth. That stem could be read as a seedling just beginning to sprout from the acorn's shell, a visual representation of growth and potential, but the stem also carried another layer of meaning, echoing the way tough characters in Japanese media are often depicted with a toothpick, cigarette, or stem hanging from their lips. It was a visual shorthand for attitude, for a creature that might be small but carried itself with confidence. Kumaru also wore geta sandals, the same traditional footwear seen on Yamanushi, and its helmet resembled the type worn by Ashigaru, the foot soldiers of feudal Japan. These details suggested a creature that was part of a military or warrior culture, but one that hadn't yet risen to prominence. The dark-type evolution planned for Kumaru hinted at a narrative arc, the idea of a young soldier who might eventually go rogue, turning into a Ronin, a masterless warrior. This thematic thread connected the acorn's growth with a story of independence and moral ambiguity, a surprisingly complex concept for such a small and simple design. The design never made it past the beta stage, but its influences lingered in the aesthetics of other grass-type Pokémon that carried similar cultural motifs. Seedot, in its final form, shared some of Kumaru's acorn-based identity, though it lacked the warrior imagery and the geta sandals. The decision to simplify Seedot's design likely came from a desire to make it feel more approachable and less thematically dense. Kumaru's concept, while charming, might have felt too specific, too tied to a particular cultural narrative that not all players would immediately recognize or connect with. What made Kumaru interesting was the way it layered meaning into a very small package. The acorn, the stem, the sandals, the helmet, all of these details told a story without needing dialogue or explicit lore. Pokémon design has always excelled at this kind of visual storytelling, but Kumaru's version of it might have been too subtle, too quiet for a creature that needed to stand out in a roster of over 100 new species. There was a Pokémon called Boyat, and its name carried the clues to its inspiration. Boyat was a Yeti, a creature from myth and mountain folklore, often compared to Sasquatch and Bigfoot. The most famous Sasquatch is indeed Bigfoot, and Boyat took that idea literally, placing a mouth directly on one of its large feet. This bizarre design choice connected to another cryptid, the Mapinguari, a creature said to wander the Amazon rainforest. Descriptions of the Mapinguari describe it as a Bigfoot-like figure, but with one unsettling difference. Its mouth is located not on its face, but in the center of its torso, surrounded by thick fur. Boyat seemed to blend these two cryptid legends, taking the Yeti's mountainous habitat and the Mapinguari's displaced mouth and relocating that mouth to the foot instead of the torso. The result was deeply strange, a creature that looked both playful and unsettling, depending on how you viewed it. The eyes were large and somewhat vacant, adding to the oddness of the design. In the version of the game where Boyat appeared, it was already in the process of being replaced by Wingull, with all of its data shifted over except for the sprite and name. This suggested that Boyat was being actively phased out, deemed too strange or too difficult to explain within the context of Hoenn's ecosystem. The decision to replace Boyat with Wingull makes sense from a practical design standpoint. Wingull is straightforward, recognizable, and fits neatly into the coastal and oceanic themes of the Hoenn region. Boyat, by contrast, felt like it belonged to a different kind of game, one more focused on cryptids and folklore than on the natural world-inspired designs that dominate most Pokémon rosters. The mouth on the foot, while creative, was the kind of detail that would have required explanation, and Pokémon rarely offers explicit lore for its stranger design choices. What Boyat represents is the edge of acceptable weirdness in Pokémon design. The series has always embraced odd and surreal creatures, but there's a line between charmingly strange and uncomfortably bizarre, and Boyat seemed to hover right on that line. Its presence in the beta files reminds us that not every idea makes it through, not because it's bad, but because it doesn't quite fit the tone or the world being built. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at a Pokémon called Bee, a small insect creature with enormous, brightly colored eyes. Bee was in the process of being replaced by Wingull in the same way Boyat was, with all of its data reassigned except for its sprite and name. Design-wise, Bee could have been an early version of Illumise, sharing a similar color scheme of yellow and blue, and the large, compound eyes typical of nocturnal insects. The name itself felt simple, almost placeholder-like, which might explain why it was eventually discarded. The most likely inspiration for Bee was the nocturnal sweat bee, a type of bee that hunts at night and possesses unusually large compound eyes to help it navigate in low light. These bees are known for their striking appearance and their ability to see in near darkness, which would explain Bee's prominent eyes. Another possibility is the robber fly, an insect with a similar color scheme that hunts by ambushing prey and is known for having some of the fastest vision in the animal kingdom. Robber flies can process visual information at over 350 frames per second, far beyond human capability, which gives them a near supernatural ability to track and capture other insects mid-flight. Bee's eyes might have been designed to suggest this kind of hypervision, perhaps even glowing or flashing like camera lights or Christmas bulbs. The idea of a bug Pokémon with glowing, fast-processing eyes is compelling, but it's also possible that the design felt too similar to other insect Pokémon already in development. Illumise and Volbeat, the Firefly Pokémon, already occupied the niche of glowing, light-emitting bugs, and Bee might have felt redundant alongside them. What's interesting about Bee is how it represents a design that was almost there, but not quite distinct enough to survive. Pokémon design requires not just a good idea, but a unique one, something that fills a specific role or aesthetic gap that no other creature fills. Bee's concept was solid, but in a generation already crowded with bug types and light-themed Pokémon, it may have simply been one idea too many. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is, where you're watching from. Toda, also known by the alternate name Koboshi, was an early version of Baltoy, and its design centered on a very specific type of Japanese toy. It was an Okiagari Koboshi, a traditional doll that always rights itself no matter how hard it's pushed or knocked over. These dolls are typically made of papier-mâché and are weighted at the bottom so they return to an upright position, symbolizing resilience and perseverance. The name Koboshi referred directly to this toy, and the Pokemon's appearance reflected that inspiration clearly. What made Toda unusual was its rock typing, which didn't immediately align with the lightweight, paper-based construction of a traditional Okiagari Koboshi. However, in ancient China, papier-mâché was sometimes hardened to the point where it became nearly as strong as stone, even being used to create helmets for soldiers. This historical detail might explain why Toda was given a rock type, despite its toy-like appearance. The idea of a self-righting doll made of hardened material strong enough to withstand battle fits neatly into the logic of Pokemon typing, where even seemingly fragile creatures can possess surprising durability. Toda was originally meant to evolve into Claydol, which makes thematic sense given that Claydol is also based on an ancient clay figure. However, in the beta files, Toda evolved into a Pokemon called Noi, which was later replaced in the final game by Baltoy. The transition from Toda to Baltoy involved refining the design into something that felt more polished and less explicitly tied to a single cultural object. Baltoy retained the spinning, self-balancing concept, but simplified the visual elements to make the creature feel more universal and less like a direct representation of a specific toy. The feedback loop that shaped Toda into Baltoy reflects a recurring theme in these early designs, the need to balance cultural specificity with broader appeal. Toda was charming, but it was also very clearly a Japanese toy, and Pokemon designs often work best when they take cultural inspiration and remix it into something that feels fresh and globally recognizable. Baltoy achieved that balance, while Toda remained a fascinating glimpse at the more literal starting point. Another design that underwent significant changes was Donkey, a Pokemon with multiple alternate names listed in the beta files, including Bakuda, Duda, Gon, and Dona. This suggested that the designers hadn't yet settled on a final name, cycling through different options as they refined the concept. Donkey was clearly an early draft of Camerupt, sharing the same basic structure of a camel-like creature with volcanic features. The design was rougher, less refined, and the volcanic humps on its back were less integrated into the overall silhouette. Camerupt, in its final form, represents a much cleaner execution of the volcano camel concept, with the humps functioning as both physical features and narrative devices, literally erupting when the Pokemon uses certain moves. Donkey lacked that cohesion, and the multiple name variations suggest that even the core identity of the Pokemon was still being explored. The decision to settle on Camerupt, with its more decisive name and tighter design, shows how important it is for a Pokemon to feel fully realized rather than halfway between ideas. The process of naming a Pokemon is more significant than it might seem. A name anchors the design, gives it personality, and helps players form an immediate connection. When a Pokemon has 4 or 5 potential names, it often means the design itself is still searching for its identity. Donkey's journey to becoming Camerupt was as much about clarifying what the creature was meant to represent as it was about refining the visual details. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it becomes clear that many of these beta Pokemon were iterations rather than entirely separate creatures. They were drafts, sketches, explorations of ideas that would eventually solidify into the designs we recognize today. The process of creation and game development is rarely linear, and these lost Pokemon serve as markers along a winding path, showing where the designers paused, reconsidered, and ultimately chose a different direction. There was a Pokemon in the beta files that resembled a small fish with a body and dorsal fins shaped like classic Asian sailboats. It was called Hitinki, and its name carried a layered meaning tied to Japanese naval history. Many ships, submarines, and related naval technology in Japan were labeled with the word Ki, a reference to the Ki Peninsula, the region where much of Japan's naval development historically took place. Tinky's design played on this connection, creating a fish that looked like it had been crafted from the same aesthetic language as traditional Japanese vessels. The sailboat fins gave Tinky a sense of motion even when stationary, as if it were perpetually gliding through water. The design was elegant in its simplicity, blending natural aquatic forms with human-made sailing technology in a way that felt cohesive. However, Tinky never made it to the final roster, likely because its concept, while charming, was too niche or too similar to other water types already planned for the region. Hoenn's water routes were already populated with a wide variety of aquatic Pokémon, and Tinky might have felt redundant in that crowded space. What makes Tinky notable is the specificity of its cultural reference. The Kii Peninsula connection would be immediately recognizable to Japanese players familiar with their country's maritime history, but it might have felt obscure to international audiences. Pokémon designs often walk a fine line between cultural specificity and global accessibility, and Tinky leaned too far toward the former. Its absence from the final game suggests that Game Freak prioritized designs that could resonate across different regions without requiring historical context to fully appreciate. There was another Pokémon called Reelin, and its most striking feature was its color. Reelin was purple, with an old, almost decayed appearance that gave it a zombie-like quality. The purple hue made it feel undead, as if it were a creature pulled from ancient times or left to decay in some forgotten corner of the world. This aesthetic was unusual for Pokémon, which typically avoids overly morbid or dark designs in favor of creatures that feel alive and vibrant. Reelin's undead appearance might have been too far outside the visual language of the series, making it difficult to integrate into the broader Hoenn ecosystem. The decision to cut Reelin likely came down to tone. Pokémon has always embraced ghost types and creatures with eerie qualities, but there's a difference between spooky and genuinely unsettling. Reelin's design crossed into territory that felt more like a horror game creature than a Pokémon, and that tonal mismatch would have made it stand out in a way that didn't serve the game. The purple, zombie-like aesthetics was memorable, but not in a way that felt appropriate for a series aimed at a broad audience, including younger players. What Reelin does show is that Game Freak was willing to experiment with darker, more unusual designs during the early stages of development. Not all of those experiments worked, but the willingness to push boundaries is part of what makes Pokémon design so varied and interesting. Reelin didn't fit, but its presence in the beta files is a reminder that the creative process involves trying ideas that don't always land, and that's a necessary part of finding the ones that do. Another creature from the beta files was Snora, a polar bear that lived in snowy environments and had a single purple stripe running across its body. That stripe was meant to resemble the aurora borealis, the natural light phenomenon that appears in polar skies. The concept was straightforward, almost too much so, a polar bear with a purple stripe. The simplicity of the design likely contributed to its removal, as it didn't offer much beyond a single visual gimmick. Pokémon designs generally work best when they layer multiple ideas together, creating creatures that feel rich and multifaceted rather than built around a single trait. Snora's concept wasn't bad, but it lacked depth. The aurora stripe was pretty, but it didn't tell a story or suggest a personality. It was decoration without substance, and in a roster of over 100 new Pokémon, designs that feel too simple or too shallow are usually the first to be cut. Hoenn already had ice types with more complex and interesting designs, and Snora couldn't compete with those more developed ideas. The lesson from Snora is that a good idea needs more than a single hook. A Pokémon needs to feel like it has a reason to exist beyond its most obvious visual trait. The Aurora stripe was nice, but it wasn't enough to carry the entire design, and without additional layers of meaning or personality, Snorer remained just a bear with a stripe. Pleasant, but ultimately forgettable. There were two Pokémon in the beta files called Happy and Supank, and their designs were strange in ways that felt both playful and uncomfortable. They appeared to be skunks, with exaggerated feminine features and bright colors, pink and yellow. Happy had two stripes on its tail, a clear reference to the classic striped skunk, and its name seemed to blend the words happy and peppy, suggesting a cheerful, energetic personality. Supank, on the other hand, held its tail up in the way real skunks do when they're about to spray, and its name played on the word spank, which had added an odd, vaguely inappropriate layer to the design. Both Pokémon wore what looked like accessories, green visors over their eyes, a pink helmet, a frilly piece around the neck, and a skirt-like frill. These details gave them the appearance of superheroes or Power Rangers, specifically the pink and yellow Rangers, who in Japanese Super Sentai shows were almost always the female characters. The design seemed to be playing with the idea of girly skunks, creatures that were supposed to smell nice despite being skunks, which are typically associated with foul odors. It was a strange subversion, and one that didn't quite land. The discomfort with Happy and Supank likely came from the way they leaned into gendered stereotypes in a way that felt forced and out of place. Pokémon designs occasionally play with gender presentation, but it's usually done with more subtlety and less an emphasis on making the Pokémon look cute or girly in a way that feels performative. The frills, the colors, the names, all of it felt like it was trying too hard to make the skunks appeal to a specific aesthetic, and that effort made the designs feel less natural and more contrived. The names also added to the strangeness. Happy could be read as happy and peppy, but Supank carried connotations of spunk mixed with spank, which introduced an odd, vaguely suggestive undertone that didn't belong in a Pokémon game. The decision to cut these designs was almost certainly the right one, as they carried too many uncomfortable implications and didn't fit the tone of the series. Skunks are tricky creatures to design around, given their real-world association with unpleasant smells, and Happy and Supank's attempt to subvert that association by making them aggressively girly just didn't work. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the later beta versions of the game, which included more refined designs that were closer to their final forms. These later betas showed that many of the cut Pokémon had already been removed, replaced by the familiar faces we know today. However, even in these later versions, small differences lingered, details that had not yet been finalized or polished. Beta Torkoal, for instance, had a fluffy tail, a detail that connected it more closely to the monogame, a mythical Japanese turtle said to live for 10,000 years. The monogame is often depicted with a long, flowing tail made of seaweed or plant matter, symbolizing its ancient age and connection to the natural world. Torkoal's final design removed the fluffy tail, simplifying the silhouette and focusing more on the tortoise shell as furnace concept. The shell itself resembled an incense diffuser, a detail that remained in both the beta and final versions, but the tail was deemed unnecessary, perhaps too decorative for a creature meant to evoke heat and endurance rather than age and mysticism. The shift from beta Torkoal to final Torkoal reflects a broader trend in these late-stage revisions, the removal of extraneous details in favor of cleaner, more focused designs. A fluffy tail might have added charm, but it also added visual noise, distracting from the core concept of a tortoise with a coal-powered shell. The decision to simplify was likely made to ensure that Torkoal's identity was immediately clear to players, even at a glance. Beta Lombre also showed differences, appearing thinner and more energetic, as if it hadn't yet let itself go. The final version of Lombre has a rounder, more relaxed appearance, giving it a laid-back, carefree personality. The beta version looked more alert, more active, and more closely resembled the general shape of a kappa, the water creature from Japanese folklore. However, it also bore a closer resemblance to Lotad's lily pad hat, and the final design shifted to emphasize the connection to Ludicolo, the final evolution, which is based on Kolok's synth plants, large tropical plants that bear round, heavy fruit. The evolution of Lombre's design shows how middle stage evolutions often get refined to better bridge the gap between their pre-evolution and their final form. Beta Lombre felt more like Lotad and less like a stepping stone toward Ludicolo, and the redesign corrected that imbalance. The rounder, softer appearance also gave Lombre a distinct personality, making it feel less like a generic water creature and more like a specific, memorable character. Melodic's beta design also carried significant differences, particularly in its head. Beta Melodic had a much more traditional European sea monster appearance, with a serpentine head that looked more menacing and less elegant. The final design shifted Melodic toward a siren-like aesthetic, emphasizing beauty and grace over raw power. This change made sense within the context of Melodic's role in the game, a Pokémon meant to represent the transformation from ugly to beautiful, from Phoebus to something stunning. A sea monster head didn't fit that narrative, as well as the more refined, feminine appearance that made it into the final version. The decision to make Melodic more siren-like also helped differentiate it from Gyarados, which already occupied the role of terrifying sea serpent. Hoenn didn't need two sea monsters, and by shifting Melodic toward elegance and beauty, Game Freak created a Pokémon that felt distinct and filled a different thematic niche. The beta version was striking, but it lacked the emotional resonance that the final design achieved. Plusle and Minun also appeared in the beta files, with earlier designs that were, in a word, strange. Their ears were oddly shaped, their tails appeared more like streaks trailing behind them, and their bodies were much rounder, giving them a more pill-like appearance. The designs seemed to emphasize their connection to electricity and particles, with the tails resembling the motion trails left by electrons moving at high speed. Electrons are often depicted in educational materials as small spheres with motion lines, and Beta Plusle and Minun seem to lean heavily into that visual metaphor. The problem with the beta designs was that they felt too abstract, too focused on representing electrical particles rather than being charming, appealing creatures. The ears, in particular, were off-putting, shaped in a way that didn't feel natural or pleasant to look at. The final designs for Plusle and Minun retained the electrical theme, but softened the edges, making them feel more like cute, cheerful companions rather than visual representations of positive and negative charges. The shift was subtle but significant, turning a concept that felt cold and scientific into something warm and endearing. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it becomes clear that the later beta versions show a different kind of refinement than the earlier ones. These weren't wholesale redesigns or entirely new creatures, but rather adjustments, the kind of fine-tuning that happens when a design is almost finished, but not quite there. A tail removed here, a head reshaped there, ears softened, bodies adjusted. Each change was small, but together they added up to the polished roster that eventually launched with Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. Aggron's pre-evolutions, Aaron and Lyran, also showed differences in the beta files. Beta Meditite and Medicham had a much more pronounced Middle Eastern aesthetic, with Meditite wearing what looked like a turban instead of the more ambiguous head shape in the final version. It also wore traditional Middle Eastern footwear, grounding the design more explicitly in a specific cultural context. Medicham's hair, meanwhile, resembled the style worn by Bayonetta, slicked back with a red band, which turned out to be a reference to a style worn by some dancers and martial artists. The look was also similar to Yuri from Street Fighter, a character known for both martial prowess and a distinctive, fashion-forward appearance. The beta designs for Metatite and Metacham felt more explicitly tied to real-world cultures and fighting game aesthetics, which gave them a sharper, more defined identity. However, that specificity also made them feel less flexible, less able to exist as creatures within the Pokémon world without constantly referencing their inspirations. The final designs softened these details, making the turbans less literal, the footwear less specific, and the hair less directly borrowed from other media. The result was a pair of Pokémon that still carried the essence of their inspirations, but felt more like original creations rather than mashups of existing ideas. Delcatty's beta design had a nose that looked disturbingly human, almost like a realistic human nose placed on a cat's face. It was unsettling in a way that didn't fit the playful, elegant personality that Delcatty was meant to convey. The decision to change the nose was an obvious one, as the human-like feature created an uncanny valley effect that made the Pokémon feel uncomfortable to look at. The final design replaced the realistic nose with a simpler, more stylized shape that fit the rest of Delcatty's soft, approachable appearance. This kind of adjustment, removing unsettling or overly realistic features, is common in Pokémon design. The series has always walked a fine line between anthropomorphism and animalism, and when a design leans too far toward human features in a way that feels jarring, it usually gets pulled back. Delcatty's beta nose is one of the more striking examples of this, a detail that was technically well drawn, but emotionally off-putting. Slaking's beta design showed that its name had been Salo from the very beginning, which is interesting given how closely that name resembles the final version. Slaking's design didn't change much between beta and final, but its pre-evolution, Vigoroth, showed more differences. Beta's feel had a face that resembled a rodent more than a seal, with prominent front teeth and fluff that made it look almost like a hamster or guinea pig. This was deeply strange, as Sfeel is clearly meant to be a seal, and the rodent-like features clashed with that identity in a way that felt confusing. The decision to change Sfeel's face to something more seal-like was one of the most obvious improvements between beta and final. Seals don't have rodent-variant faces, and giving Sfeel one created a creature that didn't fit neatly into any recognizable animal category. The final design leaned fully into the seal inspiration, creating a creature that felt cohesive and instantly recognizable. The fluff remained, but it was repositioned and reshaped to resemble the fur of young fur seals, which have a puffy appearance before their coats mature. Walrein also showed differences in the beta files, though its design was less dramatically altered than Sfeel's. The rodent-like features on beta Sfeel might have been an attempt to bridge the gap between Sfeel's round, soft appearance and Walrein's larger, more imposing tusks. The idea might have been that the rodent-like teeth would grow into tusks over time, creating a visual progression from small and cute to large and powerful. However, the execution didn't work, and the final designs abandoned that concept entirely in favor of a more straightforward seal-to-walrus evolution. Shelgon's beta design had small dragon horns, a detail that was later removed. The horns made sense from a dragon-type perspective, but they also made Shelgon feel less like a transitional cocoon stage and more like a small dragon that just happened to have a shell. The final design removed the horns, emphasizing the idea that Shelgon is in a dormant, protected state, waiting to emerge as salamence. The horns would have undermined that concept, making Shelgon feel too active and too developed for a middle stage evolution meant to represent transformation in progress. Beldum's beta design was shaped almost exactly like a bell, with a body that literally resembled a dumbbell from the side. The name Beldum comes from bell and dumb, as in dumbbell, and the beta design made that connection as literal as possible. The final design shifted away from the perfect bell shape, creating something that still evoked a bell but felt more alien and mechanical. The change made Beldum feel less like a single object and more like part of a larger organism, which fit better with its eventual evolution into Metang and Metagross. Metang's beta design looked like a clump of steel, rough and unfinished, though it still carried the sci-fi robotic aesthetic that defines the Beldum line. The final design refined that clump into something more structured, more intentional, creating a creature that felt like a machine in progress rather than a pile of metal. The shift from beta to final was subtle but significant, turning a rough idea into something that felt cohesive and purposeful. Wailord's beta design was slightly different as well, with a rear end that looked more rounded and exaggerated, giving it a shape that some players might describe as having a dumpy appearance. The final design streamlined Wailord's silhouette, making it feel more hydrodynamic and more in line with real whale anatomy. The beta version's exaggerated shape might have been intended to emphasize Wailord's massive size, but it ended up making the Pokémon look awkward rather than impressive. The final design corrected that, creating a creature that felt both enormous and graceful. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how these beta designs inform our understanding of the creative process behind Pokémon. Every design that didn't make it into the final game represents a decision, a moment where someone looked at a creature and decided it wasn't quite right. Sometimes the decision was about tone, sometimes about clarity, sometimes about redundancy. But each cut Pokémon tells a story about what Game Freak was trying to achieve and what obstacles they encountered along the way. The lost Pokémon of Generation 3 are not failures. They are explorations, rough drafts, ideas tested and ultimately set aside in favor of designs that fit better within the world being built. Some were too literal, like Yamanouchi's direct Tengu inspiration. Some were too strange, like Boyat's Footmouth or Heppy and Supank's uncomfortable girly skunk aesthetic. Some were too simple, like Snora's single Aurora stripe, and some were just slightly off, like Beta Spheel's rodent face or Beta Delcatty's human nose. What all of these designs share is a sense of potential, of ideas that could have been something but weren't given the chance to fully develop. They exist in the beta files as ghosts, creatures that almost lived but never quite crossed the threshold into the final game. Their presence reminds us that creation is not a straight path, but a winding road filled with detours, dead ends, and occasional wrong turns. The Pokémon we know and love today are the result of countless small decisions, each one shaping the final roster into something cohesive, memorable, and emotionally resonant. The beta files also reveal how much iteration goes into a single Pokémon design. A creature might start as a literal representation of a cultural symbol, then gets softened into something more abstract. It might begin with exaggerated features that feel cartoonish, then get refined into something more balanced. It might carry too many ideas at once, then get simplified into a single, focused concept. The process is messy, experimental, and often surprising, and the beta Pokémon give us a rare glimpse into that process. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it's worth considering what these lost Pokémon tell us about the values that guide Pokémon design. Clarity is important. A Pokémon should be immediately recognizable and easy to understand. Originality is important. A Pokémon should feel fresh and distinct, not like a copy of something else. Tone is important. A Pokémon should fit the world it inhabits, feeling neither too dark nor too silly. And emotional resonance is important. A Pokémon should make players feel something, whether it's affection, curiosity, excitement, or awe. The beta Pokémon that didn't make it into the final game often failed one or more of these tests. Yamanushi was too literal, Boyat was too strange, Snora was too simple, Heppy and Supank were tonally off, and so on. Each failure taught the designers something, helping them refine their instincts and sharpen their judgment. The final roster of Hoenn Pokémon is stronger because these cuts were made, because the designers were willing to let go of ideas that didn't work in order to make room for ideas that did. There's also something poignant about these lost Pokémon, something almost melancholic. They were created with care, drawn and coded and named, but they never got to exist beyond the development files. They never appeared on a trading card, never showed up in a player's party, never became someone's favorite Pokémon. They remain hidden, known only to those who dig through leaked files and beta versions, piecing together the story of what almost was. But in another sense, these lost Pokémon are not truly gone. They influenced the designs that replaced them, shaping the evolution of creatures like Pelipper, Nuzleaf, Baltoy, and Camerupt. They exist as echoes, traces of ideas that were absorbed and transformed into something new. Every Pokémon in the final game carries the weight of the designs that came before it, and the beta Pokémon are part of that lineage, part of the creative history that makes Hoenn what it is. The process of cutting and refining is essential to any creative work, but it's rarely visible to the audience. We see the finished product, polished and complete, and we don't often think about the dozens or hundreds of ideas that were tested and discarded along the way. The beta files give us that rare opportunity, a chance to see the scaffolding behind the finished structure, the rough sketches beneath the final painting. They remind us that every great game, every beloved world, is built on a foundation of trial and error, of ideas explored and abandoned, of mistakes made and lessons learned. What makes the lost Pokémon of Generation 3 so fascinating is not just what they were, but what they could have been. Paracon could have been the pelican Pokémon we remember, but Pelipper took its place and did the job better. Yamanushi could have been the Tengu Pokémon, but Nuzleaf and Shiftry transformed that idea into something more playful and creative. Boyat could have been the cryptid Pokémon, but it was too strange, too outside the boundaries of acceptable weirdness. Each of these lost designs represents a road not taken, a version of Hoenn that could have been but ultimately wasn't. The designers of Pokémon have always been willing to experiment, to push boundaries, to try ideas that might not work. That willingness to explore is what keeps the series fresh and surprising, what allows each new generation to introduce creatures that feel both familiar and unexpected. The beta Pokémon are evidence of that exploratory spirit, proof that Game Freak is willing to take risks even if those risks don't always pay off. At the same time, the beta files also show a deep commitment to quality and cohesion. Game Freak didn't just throw every idea into the game and hope for the best. They tested, revised, and refined, cutting designs that didn't work and polishing the ones that did. The result is a roster of Pokémon that feels carefully curated, where every creature has a reason to exist and a place within the larger world. The lost Pokémon didn't make the cut, but their absence makes the final roster stronger, more focused, more intentional. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how specific cultural references influenced these beta designs. Many of the lost Pokémon were deeply rooted in Japanese culture, drawing from folklore, history, and traditional toys. Yamanouchi's Tengu inspiration, Kumaru's Ashigaru helmet, Toda's Okiagari Kaboshi design, Tinky's naval references, all of these were clearly meaningful to the designers, drawn from a cultural context that shaped their creative instincts. But Pokémon is a global franchise, and designs that work well in one cultural context don't always translate to others. The challenge for Game Freak has always been finding the balance between honoring their cultural roots and creating designs that resonate with a worldwide audience. Some references can be abstracted enough that they feel universal, while others remain too specific, too tied to a single culture's history and symbolism. The beta Pokémon that lean too heavily into specific cultural references, like Yamanouchi or Tinky, were often the ones that got cut or significantly revised. The final designs retained the essence of those inspirations, but presented them in a way that felt more accessible, more open to interpretation. This process of abstraction is one of the most delicate aspects of Pokémon design. A Tengu can become a mischievous forest sprite without losing its connection to the original myth. An Okiagari Koboshi can become a spinning clay figure without needing players to know about Japanese toys. A sailboat fish can become a generic aquatic creature with elegant fins without requiring knowledge of naval history. The best Pokémon designs take specific inspirations and transform them into something that feels both grounded and imaginative, recognizable and new. The Lost Pokémon of Generation 3 show us where that transformation process broke down, where the abstraction didn't go far enough, or where the original concept was too narrow to support a full Pokémon design. They are valuable not because they represent better ideas, but because they reveal the criteria that Game Freak uses to judge whether a design is ready for the final game. Clarity, originality, tone, emotional resonance, and cultural accessibility, these are the standards that every Pokémon must meet, and the beta files are filled with designs that came close but ultimately fell short. There's also a lesson here about the nature of creativity itself. Not every idea is a good idea, and not every good idea is the right idea for a particular project. The designers of Pokémon generate hundreds of concepts for every new generation, knowing that most of those concepts will never make it to the final game. The process is wasteful by necessity, because the only way to find the truly great ideas is to generate many ideas and filter ruthlessly. The beta Pokémon are the byproduct of that filtering process, the ideas that were good enough to be developed, but not quite good enough to survive the final cut. This is true of any creative work, but it's especially visible in game development, where every asset must be coded, tested, and integrated into a larger system. A Pokémon that exists only as concept art is easy to discard, but a Pokémon that has been fully modeled, animated, and given stats and moves represents a significant investment of time and resources. The fact that Game Freak was willing to cut so many fully developed Pokémon shows their commitment to quality, their refusal to settle for designs that were merely good enough when they could push for something better. The beta files also reveal interesting patterns in how Pokémon designs evolve over time. Many of the early beta designs are highly detailed, almost over-designed, with multiple visual elements competing for attention. As the designs progressed through development, they were simplified, with extraneous details removed and core concepts emphasized. This pattern, complexity to simplicity, appears again and again in the beta files, suggesting that it's a deliberate part of Game Freak's design philosophy. Simplicity in Pokémon design is not about making creatures boring or generic. It's about making them clear and memorable. A Pokémon with too many details becomes visually cluttered, difficult to recognize at a glance, and hard to animate effectively. A Pokémon with just enough details carefully chosen and well integrated, becomes iconic, instantly recognizable, even in silhouette. The process of simplification that many beta Pokémon underwent was not about dumbing down the designs, but about distilling them to their essential elements. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it's worth reflecting on what these lost Pokémon mean for the broader history of the series. Every generation of Pokémon has its own set of beta designs, its own collection of creatures that almost made it but didn't. Some of these have been officially revealed, while others have only come to light through leaks and data mining. Together, they form a shadow history of Pokémon, a parallel timeline of what could have been. This shadow history is valuable because it shows us the evolution of Game Freak's design philosophy over time. Early generations featured beta designs that were often more monstrous, more alien, more willing to push into uncomfortable territory. Later generations showed a trend towards safer, more appealing designs with fewer rough edges and more mass market appeal. The beta Pokémon of Generation 3 sits somewhere in the middle, showing a design team that was still willing to experiment, but also increasingly aware of the need to create designs that would resonate with a global audience. The leaks that revealed these beta designs have been controversial, raising questions about intellectual property, creative privacy, and the ethics of data mining. Game Freak never intended for these designs to be public, and their release has been a source of frustration for some developers who see it as a violation of their creative process. At the same time, the leaks have provided invaluable insight into how games are made, offering a rare, behind-the-scenes look at the messy, iterative process of game development. For players and fans, the beta Pokémon are a source of endless fascination, a glimpse into an alternate version of a beloved game. They inspire speculation, debate, and creativity as fans reimagine what Hoenn might have looked like with different creatures inhabiting its roots and cities. Some beta designs have become fan favorites, with players creating art, stories, and even fan games that bring these lost Pokémon to life. In that sense, the beta Pokémon are not truly lost. They live on in the imaginations of the community, existing in a space between official canon and fan creation. The lost Pokémon of Generation 3 also remind us that game development is not a solo endeavor, but a collaborative process involving dozens or even hundreds of people. Each Pokémon design passes through the hands of artists, writers, programmers, and directors, each of whom contributes their own perspective and expertise. The feedback notes included in some of the beta files, like the comment that Yamanouchi was too literal, show how this collaborative process works in practice, with senior designers offering guidance and critique to help refine rough ideas into polished designs. This collaborative process is one of the strengths of Pokémon as a series. It ensures that no single vision dominates, that every design is tested and challenged before it's finalized. But it also means that many good ideas get lost along the way, sacrificed for the sake of cohesion, clarity, or simply because there isn't enough room in the game for every creature that gets proposed. The beta Pokémon are casualties of this process, victims of a system that prioritizes the overall quality of the game over the survival of any individual design. There's also something deeply human about the beta Pokémon, a reminder that the games we love are made by real people with their own creative instincts, biases, and blind spots. The designers who created Boyot's Footmouth or Heppy and Supank's uncomfortable aesthetic were trying to solve creative problems, to push boundaries, to explore ideas that might resonate with players. The fact that these ideas didn't work out doesn't diminish the effort or the intention behind them. Every failed design is a learning opportunity, a chance to refine creative judgment and develop a stronger sense of what works and what doesn't. The legacy of the lost Pokémon of Generation 3 is not just in the designs themselves, but in what they represent: a willingness to experiment, to take risks, to explore strange and unusual ideas even when those ideas might not pay off. Game Freak could have played it safe, sticking with familiar concepts and safe designs, but instead they pushed into weird and uncomfortable territory, testing the boundaries of what a Pokémon could be. Most of those experiments didn't work, but the ones that did, Pelipper, Nuzleaf, Baltoy, Camerupt, and all, the others, are richer and more interesting because of the creative risks that preceded them. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how these beta designs influenced not just the Pokémon that replaced them, but the broader aesthetic of the Hoenn region. Hoenn was designed to feel tropical, vibrant, and full of life, with a focus on water routes, lush forests, and volcanic landscapes. The Pokémon that populate Hoenn reflect that environment, with many designs inspired by tropical animals, aquatic creatures, and volcanic phenomena. The beta Pokémon fit into that vision, but many of them pushed too far in one direction or another, becoming too specific, too strange, or too culturally anchored to work within the broader context. The process of shaping a region's identity involves not just designing individual Pokémon, but ensuring that those Pokémon work together as a cohesive ecosystem. A single strange design might be interesting on its own, but if it doesn't fit with the other creatures around it, it can disrupt the overall feel of the region. The beta Pokémon that were cut often fell into this category, interesting in isolation, but disruptive when placed alongside the rest of the roster. The final roster of Hoenn Pokémon feels cohesive, precisely because these disruptive elements were removed, allowing the region to feel unified and internally consistent. This attention to cohesion is one of the hallmarks of Pokémon design, and it's something that's easy to overlook when playing the games. We encounter Pokémon one at a time, in specific locations and contexts, and we don't always think about how each creature fits into the larger ecosystem. But the designers think about this constantly, carefully curating the roster to ensure that every Pokémon has a place, a purpose, and a relationship to the world around it. The beta Pokémon that didn't fit were cut not because they were bad designs, but because they didn't serve the larger goal of creating a cohesive, believable region. The lost Pokémon of Generation 3 are also a reminder that creativity is not a linear process. Designs don't start perfect and stay that way. They start rough and messy, and slowly, through iteration and revision, they become something worth keeping. The beta files show us that middle stage, the point where ideas are still being tested and refined, where nothing is set in stone and everything is subject to change. It's a vulnerable, uncertain stage of the creative process, and seeing it laid bare in the beta files is both fascinating and humbling. For players who have grown up with Pokémon, the beta designs offer a new way to engage with a familiar world. They invite speculation and imagination, prompting questions about what might have been if different decisions had been made. Would Hoenn feel different with Boyat instead of Wingull? Would the region's identity shift if Tinky had survived instead of being cut? These questions don't have definitive answers, but they're fun to think about, and they deepen our appreciation for the final game by showing us the alternatives that were considered and rejected. The beta Pokémon also serve as a reminder that every creative work is the product of countless unseen choices, each one shaping the final result in ways both large and small. The games we play, the stories we read, the movies we watch, all of them are built on a foundation of discarded ideas, rough drafts, and abandoned concepts. The beta files make that foundation visible, showing us the creative scaffolding that usually remains hidden from view. It's a rare and valuable glimpse into the process of creation, one that enriches our understanding of the finished product. As we drift toward the end of this journey through the lost Pokémon of Generation 3, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate the sheer volume of creative effort that goes into every Pokémon game. Hundreds of designs are sketched, dozens are developed, and only a fraction make it into the final roster. The beta Pokémon are the visible remnants of that process, the evidence of a creative team that is willing to generate more ideas than they need, and then ruthlessly cut anything that doesn't measure up. This willingness to cut is just as important as the ability to create. A designer who falls in love with every idea, who can't bear to let anything go, will end up with a cluttered, unfocused game. A designer who is willing to cut, who can recognize when an idea isn't working and move on, will create something sharper, clearer, and more impactful. The beta files to show us that Game Freak has always been willing to cut, even when it means discarding designs that are charming, interesting, or nearly complete. That discipline is one of the reasons Pokémon has remained such a strong and enduring series. The lost Pokémon of Generation 3 will likely never appear in an official game, but they exist now in the collective memory of the Pokémon community, preserved in screenshots, discussions, and fan creations. They are no longer secret, no longer hidden in the depths of development files. They have been discovered, documented, and debated, and in that sense, they have achieved a kind of immortality. They will always be part of the history of Pokémon, a shadow roster that almost was. These designs remind us that creation is an act of both making and unmaking, of building up and tearing down, of saying yes to some ideas and no to others. Every Pokémon in the final game represents not just a successful design, but also the absence of a dozen unsuccessful ones. The beta Pokémon are the ghosts that haunt that absence, the echoes of ideas that were tested and found wanting. They are not failures, they are experiments, and every experiment, whether it succeeds or fails, contributes to the growth of the artist and the evolution of the art. The nature of preservation in game development is complicated, filled with decisions about what to keep and what to discard. Every file saved, every sprite rendered, every line of code written represents a choice, a moment where someone decided that this particular element was worth the investment of time and resources. The beta Pokémon existed in that uncertain space between concept and reality, developed far enough to have names and sprites, but not quite far enough to survive the final cull. They were caught in the middle, too complete to be dismissed as mere sketches, but too incomplete to earn a place in the finished game. What makes these creatures particularly interesting is how they reveal the different stages of development within Game Freak's process. Some Pokémon, like Donkey and Parakan, were clearly early drafts of creatures that would eventually be refined into Camerupt and Pelipper. Others, like Boyat and Heppy, seem to be unique concepts that were tested and ultimately rejected. And still others, like Bee and Tinky, were in the process of being actively replaced, their data already reassigned to different Pokémon, while their sprites lingered in the files like afterimages. This layered approach to development, where multiple versions of the same idea exist simultaneously, is common in creative work but rarely visible to outsiders. We see the finished product and assume it emerged fully formed, but the reality is much messier. Ideas overlap, designs compete, and the final roster is determined not by a single decision, but by hundreds of small choices made over months or years of development. The beta files capture that messiness, preserving a snapshot of a game in flux, a project still being shaped by the hands of its creators. Another aspect worth considering is how these beta designs reflect the technological constraints of the time. Generation 3 was released on the Game Boy Advance, a handheld system with significant limitations in terms of processing power, memory, and screen resolution. Every Pokémon had to be designed with these constraints in mind, keeping sprites small enough to run smoothly while still being visually distinct and appealing. Some beta designs might have been cut simply because they were too complex, too detailed, or too difficult to render effectively within those technical limitations. Boyat's footmouth, for example, was a striking visual concept, but animating it in battle would have required additional frames and more complex sprite work. Heppy and Supank's frilly details and accessories might have looked cluttered on the small Game Boy Advance screen, making them harder to read at a glance. These technical considerations played a role in every design decision, and some beta Pokémon might have been casualties of those limitations rather than purely creative choices. The technology shaped the art, constraining what was possible and influencing which designs survived and which didn't. The evolution of Pokémon design across generations also shows investment, increasing awareness of these technical constraints and how to work within them. Early generations featured simpler designs with fewer details, while later generations on more powerful hardware allowed for more complex creatures. Generation 3 sat at a transitional point where the hardware was more capable than the Game Boy Color, but still limited compared to later systems. The beta Pokémon reflect that transition, showing designs that pushed against those limits and sometimes pushed too far, requiring simplification or outright removal to fit within the available resources. This tension between creative ambition and technical reality is one of the defining features of game development, and it's something that players rarely think about when playing the finished product. We see a Pokémon on screen and assume it was always meant to look that way, but behind every sprite is a series of compromises, adjustments, and optimizations made to ensure the game runs smoothly and looks appealing. The beta Pokémon that were too complex or too difficult to animate serve as reminders of those constraints, evidence of ideas of outcomes that were compelling in concept but impractical in execution. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it becomes clear that the lost Pokémon of Generation 3 were shaped by multiple forces: creative vision, cultural context, technical limitations, and market considerations. Each of these forces pulled the designs in different directions, and the Pokémon that survived were those that managed to satisfy all of these competing demands. The beta Pokémon that didn't survive often failed one of these tests, interesting creatively but too culturally specific, technically feasible but tonally wrong, visually appealing but redundant with other designs. This multi-dimensional evaluation process is what makes Pokémon design so challenging and so fascinating. A creature must work on every level, visually, conceptually, technically, and emotionally, or it risks being cut. The beta files show us the designs that worked on some levels, but not others, and in doing so, they reveal the criteria that Game Freak uses to judge whether a Pokémon is truly ready for release. It's a high bar, and many designs that seem perfectly fine in isolation don't clear it when evaluated alongside the rest of the roster. The community response to these beta Pokémon has been mixed, with some players embracing the strange and unusual designs, while others understand why they were cut. Boyat, with its footmouth, has become something of a cult favorite, appreciated for its sheer weirdness and the boldness of its concept. Heppy and Supank, on the other hand, have been met with more discomfort, with many players agreeing that their gendered aesthetic and suggestive names made them inappropriate for a Pokémon game. This range of responses reflects the difficulty of designing creatures that will appeal to a wide audience. What works for some players might alienate others. The beta Pokémon also invite comparisons to other cut content from across the series, creatures and concepts that were developed but never made it into the final games. Generation 1 famously had numerous beta Pokémon revealed through early concept art and prototype builds, including designs that were later recycled or reimagined in later generations. Generation 2 had its own set of cut Pokémon, some of which were restored in later remakes or spiritual successors. Generation 3's beta roster fits into this larger pattern, part of an ongoing process of creation and refinement that has shaped every Pokémon game. What's unique about the Generation 3 beta Pokémon is the level of detail preserved in the leaked files. Many of these creatures had not just sprites, but also type information, Pokédex entries, and even developer notes. This wealth of data allows us to understand not just what these Pokémon looked like, but also how they were intended to function within the game and what the designers were thinking as they created them. The developer feedback notes, in particular, offer a rare glimpse into the internal conversations that shaped these designs, showing us the standards and expectations that guided the creative process. The preservation of this data also raises interesting questions about the nature of artistic intent and authorship in game development. The designers never intended for these beta Pokémon to be public, and their release has been a source of frustration for some members of the development team. These were private experiments, rough drafts never meant to be judged by the public eye. The fact that they've been leaked and dissected by the community complicates the relationship between creators and audience, exposing creative decisions that were meant to remain internal. At the same time, the public release of this data has enriched our understanding of Pokémon as a series and deepened our appreciation for the work that goes into creating these games. We can now see the full scope of the creative process, from early concept to final polish, and that visibility makes the final product more impressive. Knowing how many ideas were tested and discarded makes the Pokémon that did make it into the game feel more intentional, more carefully chosen. The beta Pokémon serve as a baseline, showing us what Game Freak rejected so we can better appreciate what they kept. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how these beta designs might have changed the balance and dynamics of the Generation 3 metagame. Pokémon games are not just about collecting creatures, but also about battling with them, and then every Pokémon's stats, type, and moveset contribute to the overall competitive balance. Some beta Pokémon might have been cut not because of their designs, but because their planned stats or abilities created balance issues that were difficult to resolve. Boyat, for example, if it had been given strong physical stats and a unique typing, might have become too powerful or too difficult to counter. Tinky, with its sailboat aesthetic and likely water typing, might have been redundant in a generation already packed with water-type Pokémon, adding little to the competitive scene. These gameplay considerations are just as important as visual design, and they play a significant role in determining which Pokémon survive to the final game. A creature might be visually perfect, but still get cut if it doesn't contribute meaningfully to the game's strategic depth. This focus on gameplay balance is one of the reasons Pokémon has remained such a successful competitive game for so many years. Game Freak doesn't just design creatures for aesthetic appeal, they design them to fill specific roles within the battle system, creating a diverse roster that supports a wide variety of strategies and team compositions. The beta Pokémon that were cut for balance reasons might have been casualties of this strategic thinking, removed not because they were poorly designed, but because they didn't add enough value to the competitive ecosystem. The concept of value in Pokémon design is complex and multifaceted. A Pokémon's value is determined by its visual appeal, its role in the story, its utility in battle, its place within the regional ecosystem, and its ability to resonate with players. Some beta Pokemon might have scored high on one or two of these dimensions, but failed to deliver across the board. Stora, for example, had a pleasant visual concept with the Aurora Stripe, but it didn't offer much in terms of personality, competitive utility, or narrative potential. Without multiple sources of value, it couldn't justify its place in the roster. This holistic approach to evaluating Pokemon is part of what makes the series so enduring and so beloved. Every creature is designed to serve multiple purposes, functioning as both a visual element, a gameplay tool, and a narrative device. The beta Pokemon that didn't make the cut often excelled in one area but fell short in others, and without that multidimensional appeal, they couldn't compete with designs that delivered on all fronts. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it's worth considering how the beta Pokemon reflect the broader themes and aesthetics of Generation 3. Hoenn was designed to feel like a region of exploration and discovery, with vast water routes, hidden caves, and mysterious ruins scattered throughout the landscape. The Pokemon that populate Hoenn reflect this sense of wonder, with many designs inspired by exotic creatures, ancient artifacts, and natural phenomena. The beta Pokemon fit into this vision, but many of them pushed the themes in directions that didn't quite align with the final tone of the region. Boyat, with its cryptid inspiration, leaned more toward horror and folklore than explorations and wonder. Yamanushi, with its literal Tengu design, felt more like a cultural artifact than a living creature. Heppy and Supank, with their gendered aesthetic, introduced themes of performance and presentation that didn't mesh well with Hoenn's natural, adventurous tone. Each of these designs was interesting in its own right, but they didn't serve the larger goal of creating a cohesive regional identity. The Pokemon that replaced them, or the decision to leave those design spaces empty, helped ensure that Hoenn felt unified and thematically consistent. This thematic coherence is one of the most important but least discussed aspects of Pokemon design. Every region has its own identity, its own feel, and the Pokemon that inhabit that region must support and reinforce that identity. Kanto felt urban and industrialized, Johto felt traditional and pastoral, and Hoenn felt tropical and adventurous. The beta Pokemon that didn't fit these regional themes were often the first to be cut, regardless of their individual quality. A great design in the wrong region is still a bad fit, and Game Freak has always prioritized cohesion over individual brilliance. The role of feedback in shaping these designs is also worth examining. The developer notes included in some of the beta files show that Game Freak had an internal review process where senior designers offered critiques and suggestions. Yamanushi was deemed too literal, a note that led to significant changes in the design of Noseleaf and Shiftry. This kind of feedback is essential in collaborative creative work, providing an external perspective that helps designers see their work more clearly and identify problems they might have overlooked. The willingness to accept and act on feedback is what separates good design teams from great ones. A designer who is too attached to their original vision, who can't accept criticism or revision, will struggle to create work that resonates with a broad audience. A designer who can take feedback constructively, using it to refine and improve their ideas, will produce stronger, more polished work. The beta Pokemon that were revised in response to feedback show this process in action, demonstrating how collaborative critique can transform a rough idea into something truly special. The beta files also reveal interesting patterns in how certain design elements were recycled or repurposed across different Pokemon. Kumaru's Gaeta sandals and warrior aesthetic, for example, didn't disappear entirely when that design was cut. Elements of that concept can be seen in later Pokemon, like Breloom, which carries a similar fighting spirit and martial aesthetic. Paracon's Burglar Bagbeak didn't survive, but Pelipper's more naturalistic pouch accomplished the same functional goal in a cleaner, more elegant way. These recycled elements show that good ideas rarely go to waste, even when the designs that contain them don't survive. This practice of recycling and repurposing is common in creative work, especially in large collaborative projects where ideas are constantly being generated and evaluated. A concept that doesn't work in one context might be perfect in another, and a design element that feels out of place on one creature might be exactly what another creature needs. The beta Pokémon served as a testing ground for ideas, and even when the creatures themselves were cut, the ideas they contained often found new homes in other designs. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how the beta Pokémon influenced the regional distribution of types and roles within Hoenn. Every Pokémon game needs a balanced roster with adequate representation of each type and role, ensuring that players have diverse options for building their teams. Some beta Pokémon might have been cut because they created imbalances, adding too many creatures of one type or too few of another. Maintaining this balance requires constant adjustment, and the beta files show us moments where that balance was still being calibrated. Tinky, for example, was a water-type fish Pokémon in a generation already dominated by water-type creatures. Hoenn's emphasis on ocean routes and aquatic exploration meant that water types were heavily represented, and adding another small fish Pokémon might have felt redundant. The decision to cut Tinky likely came from a recognition that the water-type roster was already full and that the design space for small aquatic creatures was better served by other Pokémon like Luvdisc or Barboach. This kind of strategic thinking about type distribution and roster balance is invisible to players, but crucial to the overall design of the game. A region with too many of one type and too few of another creates problems for team building and competitive play, limiting player options and reducing strategic diversity. The beta Pokémon that were cut for balance reasons were sacrifices made to ensure that the final roster served the needs of the game as a whole, even if it meant losing individually interesting designs. The concept of redundancy in Pokémon design is particularly important in understanding why some beta creatures were cut. Redundancy occurs when two or more Pokémon fill the same niche, offering similar visual appeal, gameplay utility, and thematic resonance. When this happens, one of the redundant designs is usually cut to make room for something more unique. B, with its glowing insect eyes, might have been redundant with Illumise and Volbeat, the Firefly Pokémon already planned for the region. Both designs focused on light-emitting bugs, and keeping both would have felt repetitive. Avoiding redundancy requires a broad view of the entire roster, understanding not just individual designs, but how they relate to each other. This is one of the most challenging aspects of Pokémon design, balancing the desire to include many different creatures with the need to ensure each one feels distinct and necessary. The beta Pokémon that were cut for redundancy weren't necessarily worse than the designs that replaced them. They just weren't different enough to justify their existence alongside similar creatures. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it's important to recognize that the beta Pokémon are not just historical curiosities, but active participants in the ongoing conversation about Pokémon design. Fans continue to discuss these creatures, create art inspired by them, and imagine alternate versions of Hoenn where different design choices were made. This creative engagement keeps the beta Pokémon alive in a way that transcends their official status, transforming them from cut content into community legends. The fan community's response to the beta Pokémon has been overwhelmingly positive, with many players expressing appreciation for the opportunity to see behind the curtain and understand how their favorite games were made. This transparency, even if unintentional, has deepened the relationship between players and developers, fostering a sense of shared investment in the creative process. Players no longer see Pokémon games as finished products handed down from on high, but as collaborative efforts shaped by countless decisions and trade-offs. This shift in perspective has also led to more thoughtful criticism and more nuanced discussions about game design. Players who understand the constraints and challenges of development are more likely to appreciate the decisions that were made and less likely to assume that cut content represents missed opportunities or developer failures. The beta Pokémon serve as educational tools, teaching players about the realities of game development and the complexity of bringing a creative visions to life. The preservation of beta content also has implications for game development as a whole, raising questions about how much of the creative process should be visible to players. Some developers prefer to keep their rough drafts and failed experiments private, maintaining a polished public image that only shows the final product. Others embrace transparency, sharing concept art, design documents, and development blogs that reveal the messy reality of creation. The leaked Pokémon beta files fall somewhere in between private documents made public against the developer's wishes, but ultimately enriching the community's understanding of the games. Another aspect worth considering is how the beta Pokémon reflect the personal tastes and creative instincts of individual designers. Every Pokémon is created by a specific artist, and that artist's style, interests, and cultural background shape the design in subtle but significant ways. Yamanouchi's Tengu design clearly came from someone with a deep knowledge of Japanese folklore, while Heppy and Supank's skunk concept might have come from someone interested in subverting expectations and playing with gendered aesthetics. These individual voices are part of what makes Pokémon design so rich and varied, but they also create friction when different designers have conflicting visions for what a Pokémon should be. The feedback process exists partly to mediate these conflicts, ensuring that individual creativity serves the larger goals of the project. A designer might create something they personally love, but if it doesn't fit the game or the region or the target audience, it will be cut or revised. This tension between personal expression and collaborative compromise is inherent to any large creative project, and the beta Pokémon are evidence of moments where that tension couldn't be resolved. They represent ideas that were too personal, too specific, too outside the boundaries of what Pokémon could be. The influence of external media and pop culture on Pokémon design is also visible in some of the beta creatures. Beta Metacham's Bayonetta-inspired hair, Heppy and Supank's Power Rangers aesthetic, and even Kamaru's samurai imagery all draw from recognizable sources in Japanese and global pop culture. These references add depth and resonance to the designs, connecting them to broader cultural narratives that players might recognize. However, they also risk making the Pokémon feel derivative, too tied to their inspirations to stand on their own. The best Pokémon designs take these inspirations and transform them into something new, abstracting the references enough that they feel fresh and original. The beta Pokémon that leaned too heavily on their inspirations were often the ones that got cut or significantly revised, while those that used their sources as starting points rather than endpoints tended to survive. This process of transformation, from reference to reinterpretation to original creation, is one of the key skills in Pokémon design, and the beta files show us examples of both successful and unsuccessful transformations. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it's worth reflecting on what the beta Pokémon tell us about the nature of creativity itself. Creativity is not a single act of inspiration, but a process of iteration, revision, and refinement. Ideas start rough and incomplete, full of potential, but not yet realized. Through repeated cycles of creation and critique, those rough ideas are shaped into something polished and complete. The beta Pokémon represent the middle stages of that process, the point where ideas have been developed but not yet perfected. This iterative process is essential to all creative work, but it's often hidden from view, kept private so that audiences only see the final, polished product. The leaked beta files disrupt that privacy, exposing the messy reality of creation and showing us just how much work goes into making something that looks effortless. Every Pokémon in the final game passed through this process, starting as a rough sketch, being refined through multiple iterations, and eventually reaching a state of completion. The beta Pokémon show us the creatures that didn't complete that journey, frozen in time at various stages of development. The emotional resonance of the beta Pokémon is also worth considering. Some players feel a sense of loss or melancholy when looking at these designs, wondering what might have been if different decisions had been made. Others feel excitement and curiosity, eager to imagine alternate timelines where Boyat and Tinky and Yamanouchi roamed the routes of Hoenn. These emotional responses speak to the power of Pokémon as a cultural phenomenon, the way these creatures capture our imaginations and become part of our personal narratives. The act of playing with Pokémon has always been about choice and possibility, deciding which creatures to catch, which to train, which to include on your team. The beta Pokémon extend that sense of possibility into the meta level, inviting us to imagine not just different teams, but different games entirely. They remind us that every game exists in a field of potential, shaped by countless decisions that could have gone differently. The Hoenn we know is just one version of many possible Hoenns, and the beta Pokémon are glimpses of those alternate realities. This sense of possibility is one of the most appealing aspects of the beta files, the way they open up new avenues for imagination and speculation. Fans create their own versions of what Boyat's moveset might have been, or how Tinky would have evolved, or where Kumaru would have appeared in the wild. These creative exercises keep the beta Pokémon alive, giving them a kind of existence they never had in the official games. They become collaborative creations, shaped by both their original designers and the community that discovered them. The relationship between official canon and fan interpretation is complex in Pokémon, more so than in many other media franchises. Pokémon has always encouraged player creativity and personal interpretation, inviting players to imagine their own stories and adventures within the framework of the games. The beta Pokémon fit naturally into this tradition, offering new material for creative exploration even though they were never officially released. They exist in a liminal space between canon and fanon, neither fully official nor purely invented. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how these beta designs might have influenced later generations of Pokémon. Ideas that don't work in one generation often resurface in later games, refined and reimagined to fit new contexts. The cryptid aesthetic of Boyat, for example, might have influenced creatures like Obstagoon or Grimmsnarl in later generations, Pokémon that embrace dark, folklore-inspired designs. The warrior themes in Kumaru's aesthetic can be seen in fighting-type Pokémon across multiple generations, creatures that blend martial arts with natural motifs. This long-term influence is hard to track definitively, but the patterns are suggestive. Game Freak doesn't waste good ideas, and concepts that don't work in one context often find homes in others. The beta Pokémon serve as a repository of ideas, a creative archive that designers can draw from when developing future games. In this sense, the beta creatures are not truly lost, but dormant, waiting for the right moment and the right context to re-emerge in new forms. The archival value of the beta files extends beyond just the Pokémon themselves to include the developer notes, type information, and design documentation preserved alongside them. These materials offer insight into Game Freak's internal processes and priorities, revealing what criteria they use to evaluate designs and what standards they hold themselves to. The feedback that Yamanouchi was too literal, for example, tells us that Game Freak values creative transformation over direct representation, preferring designs that interpret their inspirations rather than simply depicting them. This kind of documentation is invaluable for anyone interested in game design or creative development, offering real-world examples of how professional designers think and work. The beta files function as a kind of informal design tutorial, showing both successful and unsuccessful approaches to creature design. Aspiring designers can learn as much from the creatures that were cut as from those that made it into the final game, understanding not just what works, but why it works and what happens when it doesn't. The pedagogical value of the beta Pokémon is significant, especially for fans who want to understand the creative process behind their favorite games. By studying these designs, players can develop a deeper appreciation for the craft of game development and the challenges inherent in creating a cohesive, appealing roster of creatures. They can see firsthand how feedback shapes designs, how technical constraints influence creative choices, and how market considerations affect which ideas survive and which don't. As we drift toward the conclusion of this exploration, it's clear that the lost Pokémon of Generation 3 represent far more than just cut content or abandoned ideas. They are windows into the creative process, evidence of the experimental, iterative nature of game development. They show us that creation is not a straight line from concept to completion, but a winding path full of detours, revisions, and occasional dead ends. They remind us that every finished product is built on a foundation of unfinished ones, and that the absence of certain elements is just as important as the presence of others. The beta Pokémon also remind us of the human element in game development, the real people with real creative instincts who design these creatures. Every Pokémon starts as someone's idea, sketched out on paper or pixeled on a screen, given form and personality by an artist who hoped it would resonate with players. When a design gets cut, it's not just a file being deleted, but a small creative dream being set aside. The beta files preserve those dreams, keeping them alive, even though they never reached their intended audience. This preservation is both melancholic and hopeful, acknowledging loss while also celebrating the creative abundance that made that loss possible. The fact that Game Freak had so many ideas, developed so many creatures, that they could afford to cut dozens of designs speaks to the richness of their creative process. Not at every game development team has that luxury, and the beta Pokémon are evidence of a team that generated more ideas than they needed, ensuring that only the very best made it into the final game. The legacy of the lost Pokémon of Generation 3 will continue to grow as more players discover them and engage with them creatively. They will inspire fan art, fan fiction, and fan games, living on in the community's imagination, even though they never received official recognition. They will serve as teaching tools for aspiring designers and as conversation starters for players interested in game development. And they will remain as permanent reminders that creativity is a process of both making and unmaking, of saying yes to some ideas and no to others, of building something beautiful from the raw material of possibility. The act of cutting content from a game is never easy, and it's worth taking a moment to appreciate the courage that requires. Designers become attached to their creations, investing time, energy, and emotion into bringing their ideas to life. When a design gets cut, it's not just a professional decision, but a personal one, requiring the designer to let go of something they cared about for the sake of the larger project. The beta Pokémon represent dozens of these difficult decisions, moments where someone had to choose quality over quantity, cohesion over individual brilliance. This willingness to make hard choices is what separates good games from great ones. A game that includes everything, every idea that was ever proposed, would be bloated and unfocused, lacking the tight design and clear vision that makes Pokémon so appealing. The decision to cut is just as creative as the decision to create, shaping the final product through absence as much as presence. The beta Pokémon are the negative space in a sculpture, the silence between notes in a song, the elements that were removed so that what remained could shine more brightly. The concept of creative subtraction is not unique to Pokémon, but is particularly visible in these beta files. Every artist learns that sometimes the best way to improve a work is to remove elements rather than add them, simplifying and clarifying until only the essential remains. The beta Pokémon that were cut often represented excess, ideas that were interesting but not necessary, designs that worked on their own but didn't serve the larger whole. Their removal wasn't a failure, but a refinement, an act of discipline that strengthened the final game. Another dimension of this process involves thinking about how players would actually encounter and interact with these Pokémon if they had made it into the final game. A creature that looks interesting in isolation might feel out of place when encountered on a route or in a battle. Boyat, with its footmouth and cryptid aesthetic, might have been jarring when encountered alongside more naturalistic creatures like Zigzagoon or Tylo. The tonal clash would have disrupted the player's immersion, pulling them out of the world rather than drawing them deeper in. This consideration of player experience is central to Pokémon design, and it influences decisions at every level. Designers don't just think about how a Pokémon looks, but about how it feels to encounter, catch, train, and battle with that creature. A design that works perfectly as a piece of art might not work as an interactive element in a game, where players need to form emotional connections and practical relationships with the creatures they choose. The beta Pokémon that were cut often failed this experiential test, interesting to look at, but difficult to love. The emotional connection between players and Pokémon is one of the defining features of the series, and it's something that Game Freak takes very seriously. Every Pokémon needs to be not just visually appealing, but emotionally resonant, capable of inspiring affection, loyalty, or curiosity. Some beta designs, like Heppy and Supank, created discomfort rather than connection, making players feel uneasy rather than endeared. These emotional misfires were enough to doom the designs, regardless of their technical quality or creative ambition. The role of market research and player feedback in shaping these decisions is also worth considering. Game Freak doesn't design Pokémon in a vacuum. They test their ideas with focus groups, survey players, and pay attention to community responses. Some beta Pokémon might have been cut based on negative feedback from these sources, with players indicating that certain designs didn't resonate or actively turned them off. This player-centered approach to design ensures that the final roster appeals to the broadest possible audience, but it also means that more unconventional or experimental designs are often sacrificed. This tension between innovation and accessibility is one of the central challenges in Pokémon design. The series needs to feel fresh and surprising with each new generation, introducing creatures and concepts that players haven't seen before, but it also needs to feel familiar and comfortable, maintaining the core identity and appeal that has made Pokémon so successful. The beta Pokémon that pushed too far into experimental territory often couldn't balance these competing demands, feeling too strange or too different to fit within the established Pokémon aesthetic. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it becomes clear that the beta Pokémon also reflect broader trends in game design during the early 2000s. Generation 3 was released during a period of rapid technological advancement, with the Game Boy Advance offering significantly more power and flexibility than its predecessors. This new hardware opened up possibilities for more complex designs, richer animations, and more detailed sprites. Some beta Pokémon were likely experiments in pushing these new technical capabilities, testing how much detail and complexity could be added before the designs became cluttered or difficult to render. The sprites from the beta files show a range of complexity levels, with some designs featuring many small details and others embracing simpler, cleaner silhouettes. The final roster tended to favor the latter approach, with designs that were bold and clear rather than intricate and busy. This preference for clarity reflects a core principle of Pokémon design, that creatures should be recognizable at a glance, with strong silhouettes and distinctive features that make them instantly identifiable even at small sizes or low resolutions. The evolution of sprite work across the beta versions also shows a gradual refinement of this principle, with early designs being simplified and streamlined as development progressed. Kamaru's original design might have included more decorative elements or additional details that were later removed to create a cleaner, more focused sprite. This process of visual simplification parallels the conceptual simplification that many designs underwent, with complex ideas being distilled down to their essential elements. The importance of silhouette in Pokémon design cannot be overstated. A strong silhouette ensures that a Pokémon is recognizable even in challenging visual contexts, such as in the heat of battle, when viewed at small sizes, or when rendered in different art styles. Many of the beta Pokémon had weak or confusing silhouettes, with details that blurred together or shapes that weren't distinctive enough to stand out. The final designs that replaced them almost always featured stronger, more memorable silhouettes, a clear indication that this was a priority for Game Freak's designers. The relationship between 2D sprite work and conceptual design is also fascinating to consider. In the era of the Game Boy Advance, Pokémon existed primarily as small, pixel art sprites, and designers had to work within the constraints of that medium. A design that looked great in concept art might not translate well to sprite form, losing details or becoming confusing when reduced to a small grid of pixels. Some beta Pokémon were likely victims of this translation problem, working perfectly as drawings, but failing when converted to the actual in-game format. This technical translation challenge has become less severe, with more powerful hardware and higher resolutions, but it was a significant concern during Generation 3's development. Every design had to be evaluated not just as a piece of art, but as a functional game asset, something that could be animated, displayed, and interacted with within the constraints of the Game Boy Advance's hardware. The beta Pokémon that couldn't meet these technical requirements were cut, regardless of how appealing they might have been in their original concept form. Another aspect of the beta Pokémon worth examining is how they reveal Game Freak's approach to world building and ecological design. Pokémon games don't just present a collection of creatures, they present ecosystems, regions where different species coexist and interact. Every Pokémon needs to fit somewhere within this ecosystem, filling a niche and contributing to the sense that the region is a living, breathing world. Some beta designs might have been cut because they didn't fit naturally into Hoenn's environment, feeling out of place or ecologically implausible. Tinky, with its sailboat aesthetic, is an interesting example of this challenge. While the design was creative and culturally resonant, it raised questions about how such a creature would actually exist and function within the world. Would it naturally develop fins shaped like sails? What evolutionary pressure would lead to that adaptation? These ecological considerations might seem overly serious for a fantasy game, but they matter to players who want the Pokémon world to feel coherent and believable. Designs that strain credulity or raise too many unanswerable questions often get cut or revised to feel more naturalistic. This commitment to ecological plausibility, even within a fantasy context, is part of what makes Pokémon feel grounded despite its fantastical elements. The creatures are imaginative, but not arbitrary, inspired by real animals and natural phenomena in ways that make them feel like they could exist somewhere. The beta Pokémon that strayed too far from this naturalistic foundation often felt disconnected from the world, floating free from any sense of ecological context or evolutionary logic. The storytelling potential of each Pokémon also plays a role in determining which designs survive. Every Pokémon tells a story through its appearance, its typing, its evolution, and its lore. Some stories are simple and straightforward, while others are layered and complex. The best Pokémon stories are those that can be read at multiple levels, offering surface appeal for younger players while hiding deeper meaning for those who look closer. The beta Pokémon that lacked this narrative depth were often the ones that got cut, unable to compete with designs that offered richer storytelling possibilities. Kumaru's story, for example, was quite complex, depicting a young warrior in training who might eventually turn rogue. This narrative arc had potential, but it was also quite specific and might not have resonated with all players. The decision to simplify Seeded's concept removed this narrative complexity in favor of something more universally accessible, a simple acorn Pokémon that grows into larger forms. This trade-off between narrative depth and broad appeal is common in Pokémon design, with designers often choosing accessibility over complexity. The balance between simplicity and depth is one of the most delicate aspects of Pokémon design, and it's something that Game Freak has refined over multiple generations. The most successful Pokémon designs are those that appear simple on the surface, but reveal hidden depths upon closer inspection. Pikachu, for example, is visually straightforward, a round electric mouse with simple features. But beneath that simplicity lies a rich design informed by Japanese culture, electrical phenomena, and careful attention to proportion and appeal. The beta Pokémon that were too complex on the surface often lacked this balance, overwhelming players with detail rather than inviting them to discover meaning gradually. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it's worth considering how the beta Pokémon reflect the personal growth and evolution of Game Freak's design team. The designers working on Generation 3 were not the same as those who worked on Generation 1, even if some individuals overlapped. They had years of experience, feedback from millions of players, and a deeper understanding of what worked and what didn't. The beta Pokémon show us a team that was willing to experiment more boldly, to push boundaries and test unconventional ideas, confident in their ability to recognize what worked and discard what didn't. This confidence is visible in the sheer variety of concepts explored in the beta files, from cryptid creatures to gendered skunks to literal folklore figures. The design team wasn't afraid to try strange ideas, knowing that the feedback and revision process would filter out anything that didn't work. This experimental approach is essential to creative growth, allowing designers to explore new territory without the pressure of needing every idea to succeed. The beta Pokémon represent the creative freedom to fail, the understanding that not every experiment will work out, but that each one teaches something valuable. The learning that comes from failed experiments is just as important as the success of finished designs. When Yamanouchi was deemed too literal, the designers learned something about the balance between homage and originality. When Boyat was deemed too strange, they learned something about the boundaries of acceptable weirdness in Pokémon. When Heppy and Supank made players uncomfortable, they learned something about gendered aesthetics and tone. Each failure refined their creative instincts, making them better equipped to create successful designs in the future. This process of learning through failure is universal in creative work, but it's rarely as visible as it is in the Pokémon beta files. Most creative industries keep their failures private, showing only the polished successes to the public. The leak of the beta files disrupts that convention, exposing the failures alongside the successes and revealing the educational value of both. For aspiring designers, this visibility is invaluable, showing not just what great design looks like, but also what unsuccessful design looks like and why it doesn't work. The community's reaction to specific beta Pokémon also reveals interesting patterns in player preferences and expectations. Boyat has become something of a cult favorite precisely because of its weirdness, attracting players who appreciate unconventional and boundary-pushing designs. Meanwhile, designs like Snora are often dismissed as boring or uninspired, too simple to generate much interest. These varied reactions show that there's no single formula for what makes a Pokémon successful. Different players are drawn to different qualities, and what appeals to one person might not work for another. This diversity of player preferences is part of what makes Pokémon such a broad and inclusive series, capable of appealing to players with very different tastes and interests. Some players love cute, simple designs like Pikachu or Jigglypuff, while others prefer complex, intimidating creatures like Tyranitar or Garchomp. Some appreciate designs rooted in real animals, while others prefer more fantastical or abstract concepts. The challenge for Game Freak is creating a roster that offers something for everyone, and that challenge becomes more difficult with each new generation as the total number of Pokémon grows. The beta Pokémon that were cut often fell victim to this diversity of preferences, appealing strongly to one segment of the audience while alienating another. Heppy and Supank might have found an audience among players who appreciated their subversive take on gender and cuteness, but they would have turned off many others who found the designs uncomfortable or inappropriate. Game Freak tends to err on the side of broad appeal, cutting designs that polarize in favor of those that generate more universal positive responses. This risk-averse approach has its critics, who argue that it leads to safer, less interesting designs over time. They point to earlier generations, which included more unconventional creatures like Mr. Mime or Jinx, as evidence that Pokémon was once willing to take bigger risks. The beta files from Generation 3 show that Game Freak was still exploring unconventional territory during this period, but they were also becoming more cautious about which experiments made it into the final game. This caution has only increased in later generations, with fewer truly weird or unsettling designs making it past the planning stages. The tension between creative risk and commercial success is inherent to any mass-market entertainment product, and Pokémon is no exception. Game Freak wants to create games that are successful, that sell well, and satisfy millions of players. But they also want to create games that are interesting, innovative, and surprising. These goals don't always align, and the beta Pokémon represent moments where creative ambition had to give way to commercial pragmatism. The designs that were too weird, too niche, or too polarizing were cut, ensuring that the final game could appeal to the widest possible audience. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how the beta Pokémon might have influenced the competitive metagame if they had been included in the final game. Competitive Pokémon battling has become a significant part of the franchise, with players around the world participating in tournaments and ranked matches. Every Pokemon's stats, abilities, and move pool contribute to this competitive ecosystem, and new additions can significantly shift the metagame. Some beta Pokemon might have been cut because their planned stats or abilities would have created balance issues or dominated the competitive scene. Balancing a competitive game with over 100 new creatures is extraordinarily difficult, requiring careful attention to how each Pokemon interacts with every other. A creature that seems balanced in isolation might become overpowered when combined with certain abilities or held items. A typing that seems interesting might create problematic matchups that favor certain playstyles over others. The beta Pokemon that were cut for competitive balance reasons might have been casualties of this complex strategic calculus, removed to ensure that the metagame remained diverse and healthy. The importance of competitive balance has grown significantly since Generation 3, with Game Freak paying increasing attention to how Pokémon are used in competitive play. Early generations featured many creatures that were clearly superior or inferior to others, creating metagames dominated by a small number of powerful Pokémon. Later generations have shown more careful stat distribution and ability design, creating rosters where more creatures are viable in competitive play. The beta Pokémon from Generation 3 might represent an earlier, less refined approach to balance, with some designs being cut as Game Freak developed a more sophisticated understanding of competitive play. The evolution of Game Freak's approach to competitive balance is visible in how stats and abilities have been distributed across generations. Generation 3 introduced abilities, a new mechanic that added significant depth to competitive play. Some beta Pokemon might have been planned with abilities that proved too strong or too weak, requiring revision or removal. This iterative process of testing and balancing is ongoing, with Game Freak continuing to refine their approach with each new generation. The documentation in the beta files sometimes includes planned stats, types, and abilities for the cut Pokémon, offering glimpses of how these creatures might have functioned in battle. Some of these planned stats seem reasonable and well-balanced, while others appear problematic, either too weak to be useful or too strong to be fair. The presence of these problematic stat distributions suggests that competitive balance was an active concern during development, and that some designs were cut when their battle utility couldn't be balanced satisfactorily. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it's worth considering how the beta Pokémon reflect the cultural moment in which they were created. The early 2000s was a particular time in gaming history, with certain aesthetic trends, cultural references, and design philosophies dominating the industry. Some beta Pokémon, like those with anime-inspired features or martial arts themes, feel very much of their time, reflecting the popular media and cultural touchstones of that era. These time-specific references might have contributed to some designs being cut, as Game Freak sought to create creatures that would feel timeless rather than dated. The goal of creating timeless designs is particularly important for a franchise like Pokémon, which expects each game to remain relevant and appealing for years or even decades. A design that feels trendy or of the moment might look dated within a few years, while a more classic or universal design maintains its appeal indefinitely. The beta Pokémon that leaned too heavily on contemporary trends were often the ones that got cut, while those with more timeless qualities tended to survive. This preference for timelessness is part of what has allowed Pokémon to endure for so long, with creatures from the earliest generations still feeling fresh and relevant today. The aesthetic consistency across Pokémon generations is remarkable, with creatures from different eras able to coexist without feeling jarring or out of place. This consistency is the result of careful curation, with Game Freak maintaining certain design principles and standards that transcend individual generations. The beta Pokémon that violated these principles, whether through excessive detail, inappropriate tone, or stylistic inconsistency, were cut to preserve the overall aesthetic coherence of the series. This aesthetic coherence extends beyond just visual design to include naming conventions, sound design, and animation patterns. Every aspect of a Pokémon's presentation needs to align with established series standards, creating a unified experience that feels distinctly like Pokémon. The beta creatures that didn't meet these standards in any dimension were often cut, even if they excelled in others. A Pokémon might have a great visual design, but a name that doesn't fit the series' naming conventions, or a strong concept but animation that doesn't match established movement patterns. The holistic nature of Pokémon design, requiring success across multiple dimensions simultaneously, makes the creation of new creatures particularly challenging. It's not enough for a design to work visually, it must also work conceptually, mechanically, narratively, and culturally. The beta Pokémon that failed in any one of these tests were at risk of being cut, and many of them failed multiple tests simultaneously. Boyat, for example, struggled with both visual weirdness and ecological implausibility. Heppy and Supank had tonal issues and uncomfortable gendered elements. These multiple failure points made the decisions to cut these designs relatively straightforward. The criteria for success in Pokémon design have evolved and become more stringent over time, with later generations facing higher bars for inclusion. This increasing selectivity has led to fewer truly experimental designs making it into final games, but it has also ensured that the designs that do make it through are of consistently high quality. The beta Pokémon from Generation 3 show a design team in transition, still willing to experiment boldly, but also beginning to apply more rigorous standards to determine which experiments would make it to the final game. Another aspect worth examining is how the beta Pokémon reveal the role of luck and timing in creative work. Some designs might have been cut not because they were inherently flawed, but because they were developed at the wrong time, when the roster was already full, or when similar designs had already been approved. If Tinky had been created for a generation with fewer water types, it might have survived. If Boyat had been created for a game with a more explicit folklore or cryptid theme, it might have found a home. The fact that these designs were created for Generation 3, with its specific themes and constraints, meant they didn't fit and had to be cut. This element of contingency and context dependence is true of all creative work, but is particularly visible in the beta files. A great idea at the wrong time is still a failed idea, and timing is often beyond the control of individual designers. The best they can do is create compelling designs and hope that they align with the project's needs and direction. The beta Pokémon that were cut due to timing or contextual mismatch represent this reality, reminding us that creative success depends on factors beyond just quality and effort. The preservation of these beta designs in leaked files also raises interesting questions about creative ownership and legacy. These creatures were never meant to be public, never intended to be judged by outside audiences. They were private experiments, internal documents meant only for the development team. The fact that they've been leaked and widely disseminated complicates their status, transforming them from private failures into public artifacts. The designers who created them might feel exposed or vulnerable, having their rejected work examined and critiqued by millions of players. This tension between privacy and transparency in creative work is ongoing and unresolved, with valid arguments on both sides. Some argue that transparency benefits everyone, teaching aspiring creators and enriching public understanding of the creative process. Others argue that creators deserve privacy, the freedom to experiment and fail without public scrutiny. The Pokémon beta leaks have forced this conversation into the open, creating a situation where private creative work has become public knowledge, whether the creators wanted that or not. The impact of these leaks on future development is also worth considering. Knowing that internal files might eventually be leaked could make designers more cautious, less willing to experiment with bold or unconventional ideas that might be embarrassing if made public. This chilling effect on creativity would be unfortunate, potentially leading to safer, more conservative designs that don't push boundaries or take risks. Alternatively, the leaks might encourage more transparency, with Game Freak choosing to share development materials officially rather than having them revealed through unauthorized means. The future of Pokémon design remains uncertain, but the beta files from Generation 3 offer valuable lessons for anyone interested in creative development. They show us that great work is built on a foundation of experimentation, iteration, and willingness to discard ideas that don't work. They remind us that every success is accompanied by numerous failures, and that those failures are not shameful but necessary parts of the creative process. And they demonstrate that creation is not a solitary act, but a collaborative effort shaped by feedback, critique, and the contributions of many different people. As we approach the end of this journey through the lost Pokémon of Generation 3, it's worth reflecting on what these creatures mean for the broader Pokémon community and culture. They have become part of the series' mythology, alternate possibilities that exist alongside the official canon. They inspire creativity, conversation, and continued engagement with the games, giving fans new material to explore and discuss years after Generation 3's original release. In this sense, the beta Pokémon have achieved a kind of success, even though they never made it into the final game. The relationship between official content and community knowledge has shifted dramatically since these beta files were leaked. Players now have access to information that was never meant to be public, and that access has changed how they think about and engage with Pokémon. The games are no longer just finished products to be consumed, but processes to be examined, with players curious about every decision that shaped the final experience. This shift toward transparency and behind-the-scenes knowledge has enriched the community in many ways, fostering deeper appreciation for the craft of game development. The beta Pokémon serve as permanent reminders that every game we play is just one version of many possible games, shaped by countless decisions that could have gone differently. They invite us to imagine alternate timelines, to wonder what Hoenn would have felt like with different creatures inhabiting its roots and cities. This imaginative exercise is not just idle speculation, but a form of creative engagement, allowing players to participate in the design process retroactively by considering what might have been and why certain choices were made. The educational value of these beta files extends beyond just Pokémon design to encompass broader lessons about creativity, collaboration, and the nature of artistic work. They show us that creation is messy, iterative, and often frustrating, requiring patience, discipline, and willingness to accept failure. They demonstrate that no creative work emerges perfect on the first try, that refinement and revision are essential parts of the process. And they remind us that collaboration, when done well, makes creative work stronger, with multiple perspectives and voices contributing to a final product that is richer and more compelling than any individual could create alone. For aspiring game designers and artists, the beta Pokémon offer invaluable lessons about what works and what doesn't in creature design. They provide concrete examples of common pitfalls, from being too literal in translating real-world inspirations to creating designs that are too complex or too simple. They show the importance of balance, cohesion, and restraint, demonstrating that sometimes the best design choice is to cut an element rather than add one, These lessons are applicable far beyond Pokémon, relevant to anyone working in creative fields where decisions must be made about what to include and what to leave out. The beta files also highlight the importance of feedback and critique in creative work. The developer notes preserved alongside some designs show how external perspectives can identify problems that the original designer might have missed. Yamanouchi's feedback about being too literal led to the creation of Newsleaf, a more creative and playful interpretation of the same basic concept. This kind of constructive criticism is essential to artistic growth, helping creators see their work more clearly and understand where improvements can be made. The ability to accept and act on feedback is one of the most important skills for any creative professional, and it's something that must be cultivated over time. Designers who are too attached to their original visions, who can't tolerate criticism or revision, will struggle to create work that resonates with broad audiences. Designers who can listen to feedback, consider it objectively, and use it to improve their work will create stronger, more polished final products. The beta Pokémon show this process in action, with designs being refined through multiple iterations based on internal feedback. The community's ongoing engagement with the beta Pokémon also demonstrates how creative work can have life and impact beyond its intended purpose. These designs were meant to be internal documents, tools for development, rather than final products. But once they were leaked and made public, they took on new meaning and new value, becoming objects of study, sources of inspiration, and catalysts for conversation. This transformation shows us that creative work, once released into the world, takes on a life of its own, interpreted and reinterpreted by audiences in ways the original creators might never have anticipated. The legacy of the lost Pokémon of Generation 3 is still being written as new players discover them and add their own interpretations to the ongoing conversation. Some might create fan games that include these beta creatures, giving them the existence they never had in official releases. Others might write stories, exploring what role these Pokémon would have played in Hoenn's ecosystem and culture. Still others might simply appreciate them as historical curiosities, fascinating glimpses into the development of a beloved game. All of these responses are valid, all contribute to the rich tapestry of Pokémon culture. The act of preservation itself is worth acknowledging here. The beta files were saved, stored, and eventually leaked by people who understood their value, who recognized that these documents represented important pieces of gaming history. Without those acts of preservation, these designs would have been lost forever, existing only in the memories of the developers who created them. The fact that we can examine and discuss them today is the result of both official documentation practices and unofficial preservation efforts, a combination of formal and informal archiving that has created a rich historical record. This historical record allows us to trace the evolution of Pokémon design over time, seeing how aesthetic preferences, technical capabilities, and design philosophies have shifted across generations. The beta Pokémon from Generation 3 occupy a specific moment in that evolution, showing a design team that was still willing to take bold, creative risks, while also developing more sophisticated standards for what made a successful Pokémon. They represent a transitional period, bridging the more experimental early generations and the more polished later ones. The influence of these beta designs on fan-created content has been significant, with many artists and designers drawing inspiration from the leaked files to create their own Pokémon-inspired work. Some have taken the beta designs and reimagined them, creating alternate versions that address the problems that led to their original rejection. Others have used the beta Pokémon as jumping-off points for entirely new creatures, inspired by the creative directions suggested but not fully explored. This generative effect shows how creative work can inspire more creative work, with each iteration building on what came before. The conversation around the beta Pokémon has also enriched discussions about what makes good design in general, not just in Pokémon, but across all creative mediums. The principles visible in these files, clarity, cohesion, emotional resonance, technical feasibility, apply to everything from graphic design to architecture to product development. The specific lessons learned from examining why certain Pokémon were cut can inform decision-making in any creative field where choices must be made about what to include and what to discard. As we reflect on the lost Pokémon of Generation 3 one final time, we can appreciate them not as failures, but as necessary steps in the creative journey. They represent the experimental phase of development, where ideas are tested without fear of failure. They show us the rough drafts that preceded the polished final versions, reminding us that all great work begins in uncertainty and imperfection. They demonstrate that creativity requires both the courage to try new things and the wisdom to recognize when those new things aren't working. The beta Pokémon will continue to fascinate players and designers for years to come, serving as permanent reminders of the complex, iterative nature of creative work. They are ghosts in the machine, traces of what almost was, preserved in the code and files of a game that chose a different path. They exist in the space between imagination and reality, never quite making it to full existence, but never quite disappearing either. They are, in their own way, as much a part of Pokémon history as the creatures that did make it into the final game. The story of these lost creatures reminds us quite clearly that every finished work carries within it the quiet shadows of what it chose not to be, and those shadows are just as important to understanding the final creation as the elements that remain fully visible in the light of completion and eventual release into the world. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.